Thoughts on reparations? Yep, I think there is an entirely valid case to be answered for reparatory justice. Remember, Haiti never stopped paying reparations to France till 1947. The bonds that were taken out so Britain could pay slave masters compensation, reparations for losing their slaves, British taxpayers did not stop paying them off until 2015. That means British Caribbean taxpayers were paying back the bonds that were used to pay back slave masters. This ain't ancient history, and people want to act like 200 years ago. 200 years ago, we're talking about no. Man finished getting paid the other day, and so I think there's an entirely legitimate case to be answered. Which brings me on to one thing which you lot ain't asked a question about, but there is a really toxic thing I see among some Caribbeans and some Black Americans running around saying that Africans sold us into slavery. I would recommend every single one of you exercise some common sense and think a bit more about history, and I'll explain why. But also read, there's a book called Resisting the Slave Trade, West African Strategies. The reason why I say this is because, firstly, political treachery has been normal among every group of people for all of human history, right? The Visigoth Spaniards invited the Moors to conquer them. The Chinese helped the British sell opium in China. The Indian elite profited from the Bengal famine. The Anglo-Irish landlords profited from the famine in Ireland, and on and on and on, right? What actually happened in West Africa was that some people, of course, sold human beings, just as some black people would sell human beings today. Just as some people of every ethnicity today are engaged in human trafficking. What many of you have been so successfully brainwashed into believing is that there was no resistance in Africa itself. There were more rebellions on the west coast of Africa against transatlantic slavery than any island in the Caribbean. So tell the whole story. If you want to say there were African slave trades, of course there were, no problem. Just tell the whole story though, innit? There were more rebellions, I'm going to repeat that, on the west coast of Africa against transatlantic slavery than any island in the Caribbean. On top of that, the Haitian Revolution was fought by people born in Africa. Where do you think they learned to fight like that, Regin? They were in armies in Africa. They were in armies in the Congo. They were in armies in Ghana. Most of the people who fought the Haitian Revolution were Africans. The Maroons in Jamaica were not born in Jamaica. They were born in Ghana. Where do you think they learned to fight like that? They learned those particular military tactics in West Africa. So all I'm saying is just tell the whole story. Some black people would sell you down the river tomorrow for money, because that's how human beings work. Some of our own families would backstab us for money, because that's how human beings work. But this idea that Africans were, on top of it, there's this idea that there's Africans, them and us. No black Americans, Jamaicans or Caribbeans left West Africa. The only people that left West Africa were Igbo, Yoruba, Hausa, Ibibio, Wolof, Tukolo, Puel. They were Africans. They were Congo, they were Lingala, etc., etc., etc. So this idea that there was us and them, what about the African families left behind whose families got sold into slavery? You're not interested in their story? You're not interested in what they did to get their family members back? Your literal cousins were left behind. So that's one thing I really want to address, because a lack of honesty around the history. Last thing I'll say on it, and some of those same Caribbeans and black Americans who say that are much less quick to talk about the history of Liberia. Yeah? Let's talk the whole thing. Much less quick to talk about the fact that the Maroons fought in the conquest of Ashanti, or that they did a deal with the British to preserve slavery. I'm not even passing a judgment on it all. History is very complicated, and no one knows what they would do in a given situation if they weren't there. Just tell the whole story, innit? Yeah? The Haitian Revolution was a continuation of African resistance in Africa. The Jamaican Maroons were a continuation of African resistance in Africa. Africa was not a paradise. There was class in Africa, like there is everywhere else in the world. African elites in one social class, willing to do things to their own commoners that they weren't willing to do people of their social class or of a different ethnicity, and so on and so forth. But this kind of simplistic blanket Africa. Last thing I'll say on it, I promise. The distance between Timbuktu and Luango, yeah, which is the capital of the old Empire of Congo, is greater than the distance from London to Istanbul. That's how big Africa is. And those two places are like this far apart on a dot in a map in West Africa. So you're telling me the whole of Africa was just one polity on top of all of that? There weren't different ethnic groups, there weren't different cultures, there weren't different histories, and so on and so forth, right? So just tell the whole story. We don't need romanticism. In loads of places and in loads of ways. So even though we've had revolutions, we got rid of formal colonialism in Africa, and it was tough. We got rid of slavery in the Caribbean, and it was very tough, or rather our ancestors did. We still got to get the architects, the doctors, the scientists, the engineers, so on and so forth, hold our corrupt governments to account, so on and so forth. All of those challenges still await, and I don't have the answer to all of that. And anyone that tells you that they do, I would suggest to you is a charlatan. Yeah, anyone that thinks they have all of the answers about all of the world's problems is fibbing to you, bruv. And in fact, you might know or have better answers or better things to say on that than me, but major things are happening and major things are changing. So we'll see. I'm not one just for the black faces in high places kind of thing. Obama was a black face in a high place. I mean, I read them why they are tall, you know. So it was also important that the black face in higher place has interest for his particular community, but and more importantly, like, it's just a decent human being, right? I don't want no, bruv. Some of our leaders, let's be honest, I don't rate them, bruv, at all. They're thieves. I don't rate them just because they're black. Idiot thing. So diversity in leadership is as important that the person has some integrity and has their community's interest at heart as it is that they just look like you. So I think it's that balance too, though, innit? Because we're seeing some of the people pushing the worst immigration policies in the country right now. Some of the people who voted for the war in Iraq, for example, they might look just like the man them. I don't rate them people. Let's be honest. I want people that I agree with broadly about politics too. I don't just want optics. Yeah, as it's just been put, I don't just want optics. Don't think you can just feed me a black face and I'm going to get excited. I understand why for black Americans, emotionally, because they lived under apartheid in a way that we didn't in the same way in Britain, emotionally having a black leader was really important for them. I get that. I totally understand that. For us in Britain, we come from majority black countries where some of the leaders are idiots. You think you could just fool us with a black politician? We know some of them are fools, Bridget. Or as the Jamaican Rastas put it, even though Rastas are black nationalists, down with white and black oppressors. We're not just trying to replace white oppressors with black oppressors, yeah? So I think that, yes, representation is important. Yes, diversity in leadership is important, but credentials is important, though, isn't it? That's the thing. I think the way it's phrased, for example, is that the history of racial slavery in the Americas is black history. No, it's as much British history. If we're talking about the history of slavery in Jamaica, that's part of Britain's history. So Britain, for example, we talk a lot about the abolition of slavery. We'll erect a statue of Wilberforce or a painting of Wilberforce. But Sam Sharp, the Jamaican who led the largest slave rebellion in British history, is as much part of Britain's history as anything else. He helped lead to the abolition. That rebellion was just 2 years before the abolition of slavery. Sam Sharp is part of British history. And so I think even phrasing it as Black History, which I get why it is, we have Black History Month, that's very important to correct a lot of the misconceptions about Africa and the Caribbean. But understanding that Britain, a lot of people understand Britain had an empire. Very few people understand that Britain was an empire. I.e. the history of the entire British Empire is British history. And that's the way I would phrase it. That's the way I would get it into the curriculum. The only way we're going to have peace and respect in a increasingly multi-ethnic society is if people understand where others are coming from. And if children, not just black children either, if white kids are being taught, as many have been taught for generations now, slavery happened, black people sat around doing nothing and they waited for William Wilberforce to come and save them, that's not good for anybody. Because then when black people do rebel, people are going to be like, oh, what happened to these people? I thought they were the people that just sit around and do nothing and wait for white saviours. Whereas if you teach the real history, everyone can sort of deal with this contentious issue in a bit more of a mutually respectful manner. If the actual history is, there was this history of racial slavery, very brutal, very horrible. Only once in the whole history of the world has a group of people staged a successful slave revolution. That happens to be Africans in the Caribbean. It stops being a story that's about victimhood and it starts actually being a story about revolutionary success. And can you see that for black children in particular, that is a very different way of learning the history of slavery than just, you know, your ancestors sat around waiting for Wilberforce. And even for white kids, it's like, right, their men were on job. Their ancestors got enslaved, they burned down plantations, they fought back, and that is a major part of what led to the abolition of slavery. So it's also about just teaching the whole story, yeah? So in that context, still now, kids are going to school and they're being taught stuff that just isn't true. They're being taught Britain is an equal society, equal opportunities. Do you think the kids who go private school, they get taught to be manual labourers or to work in a hairdressers or any of those kind of things? No, of course they don't. Now, there is absolutely nothing wrong with those jobs. My pops was a manual labourer. No, like, I rate that. Honest day's work. But let's just be honest with young people, that if you go to a state school, you'll be educated to get a working class job. And if you happen to be exceptionally talented, very bright, lucky enough to have great parents, they might pluck you out and send you to a posh school so that you don't infect all the other plebs with the idea that you can just be whatever you want. So in a class-based society, the education system does not teach. I left school with straight A's. I never knew what capitalism was when I left school. I left school with straight A's. I never knew what a mortgage was when I left school. I left school with straight A's. I never knew what interest rate was when I left school. So all of these things, I never knew how to set up a limited company. I never knew how to grow food. So there are very specific things we're being taught in school. I never learned self-defense. So for me, someone just put they teach imperialism in private schools. Exactly, right? So for me, you know, if I was Minister of Education tomorrow, I would be teaching kids how to grow their own food, how to farm their own land, what capitalism was, what interest rates were. If we're going to do capitalism, at least give working class kids an equal chance to compete within the economy as it exists, which they're not doing. So I would reform the education system in a major way to make it much more meritocratic. There are some countries, as someone just pointed out here, ironically, a country like Jamaica, if you're an extremely bright kid from the ghetto, you can realistically become the Minister of Education, as has happened. If you're from a rural poor family, because there is a system in Jamaica where if you're extremely, extremely bright, you can work your way up and go to one of the better schools. So I'd bring in something like that, but I also would have major reforms in terms of what people are taught. Practical skills, vocational skills and life skills. Relationships. Parenting is not taught at school. Shout out to a man like Loki. No one teaches you how to be a parent, the biggest job you're ever going to have to do. A white kid from a poorer background, teachers often assume that you're not as bright as you are, and we get that. Let's be honest. You hear a Liverpool accent or a hood, Cockney accent or whatever, people have certain perceptions. For black children in particular, regardless of social class, what happens is children are much less likely to be entered for higher tier exams, and teachers under-assess their intelligence by a much greater degree than any other people, regardless of class. So I would reform that system, and I would make GCSE entrance based solely on your SAT scores, and you would see that actually that would make things much more meritocratic. I go into this a lot in Natives. I've got 2 chapters on education, and so all of the citations are there. I don't want people to think I'm just being conspiratorial. I look at all of the data on that. But yeah. Let me go to a next question. I'll answer that one, even though I did a thread on this the other day. The thoughts on black crime. I mean, unless the violence in Naples, in the hood in Naples, there's a hood in Naples called Scampia, Segondigliano. Anyone who's watched Gomorrah knows what I'm talking about, right? But I've actually been to Naples, right? In the hood in Naples, people sell drugs, people kill people. Like any hood anywhere, right? In the hood in Glasgow, people sell drugs, people kill people. In the hood in Mexico, people sell drugs, people kill people. We've got to ask ourselves why in all of those cases where class is clearly the primary connector, when trading illegal drugs plus lack of opportunity is clearly the common denominator, why only for black kids does black on black violence get offered? And even if you're a mixed race ex-road youth like me, it's the black half's fault that you was violent, right? It's black on black violence. This is the biggest gaslighting waste of argument ever. Black on black violence doesn't exist. You think if black roadmen get robbed by a Turkish man, they're going to be like, well, you know what? They're not black, so I'm not going to clap back or do nothing. Even though I owe my Connect money and I'm in beef now, I don't kill black people. Of course not. And if you want to put that to the test, go and rob some black roadman and see what happens. I wouldn't recommend it, right? Furthermore, do you think white road youths in Liverpool would pet to beef the man then? Of course they would, right? Who do you think is a greater risk of going to prison? A white youth from the hood in Liverpool whose parents are on drugs, for example, which is the case of some of the youths I've worked with, or a middle-class black youth who lives in Richmond. And so I think that it's just a gaslight, bruv. Yes, don't get me wrong. Yes, we should be working to clean up the violence in the hood. Yes, we should be working for unity in black neighbourhoods, but there's no violence among middle-class black people. Even in Jamaica, which has one of the highest murder rates in the world, if you live in Cherry Gardens or Norbrook or Plantation Heights, bruv, you might as well live in Hampstead. It's lovely, lovely. I'm considering moving there. That's how lovely it is. So violence everywhere in the world, street violence, is based on much more on class than race. Ghana has a murder rate that is no higher than Belgium's murder rate. In fact, there's only one city in the whole of Africa. Outside of South Africa, there is no city in the whole of Africa in the world's top 50 for murder rate. Outside of South Africa. Only South Africa on the whole continent of Africa, only South Africa has cities that are in the top 50 in the world for murder rate. All of the rest of the top 50 of the cities in the world are in the Americas. And even with London, if you chat to most people in London, even most black youths, and you say, hey, do you think London is the most violent city in Britain? They'll say yes, it isn't. Usually it comes around 7 or 8. If you ask them what percentage of violent murders do you think are committed by black youths in London, young black boys, should I say, or black teenagers, I've asked teenagers this question, they say 80%, 90%. No, it's about 15% of the murders are committed by black teenagers. Then some are committed by the man then. But this, again, the whole thing is just gaslighting. We can care about more than one political issue at once. And most of us who have an opinion on police brutality and are out there doing work have also been in the streets trying to get the man them to do other things and trying to provide employment for people and trying to clean up our community. So it's an extra gaslight because the two sets of people are often very connected. Any yard man in the house will tell you that's the hood, right? When I said to the young boys in this class, what do you want to be when you're older? You know what the first response was? Man said marine biologist. What's a marine biologist, big man? I had to go Google it. 12-year-old boy from the wickedest ghetto in Kingston, marine biologist. The next boy said lawyer. Next youth said judge. The point is, of course, young black children from the ghetto in Jamaica understand that their disadvantages are based on class. They know that there's no ceiling for them because they're black. There's a ceiling for them because they're poor. And so you see the constant bombardment of negative images about black people. How do you expect it not to affect young black boys? If young black boys think 90% of the murders in London are being done by the man them, they're going to go out in the street on smoke for the man them. And equally, you've only got to look at working class white kids. You know how much schools I've been to in the north of England where I'm working with working class white kids, and they make fun of each other for being clever. Because they've internalized the idea that being clever is not their identity. The funny part about it is there's a long history of working class white intelligentsia in Britain. You think about people like Richard Hogarth or E.P. Thompson, but the class system in Britain is like magic. It convinces people to behave against their own interests. Yeah, and so this idea that it's just a black issue, nah, the African kids in England are doing better in school than mixed race kids, than black English kids, and than poor white kids. You'll never see that in the UK media. Even when I pointed it out on the news, everyone was like, no, I never even thought about it like that, and now I think about it, every uni I go to, it's bare Ghanaian and Nigerian youths. Shock horror, because enough of the Ghanaian and Nigerian and Zimbabwean young people in Britain, their parents had uni degrees before they got here, big man. They might be physically in Peckham, they might be physically in Tottenham, they might be physically in Hackney, but their parents had uni degrees before they got here. So it's no surprise that they're doing well in school, even in the facts of racism. And their parents, let's be real, I can see all my Niger and Ghana brethren and people and supporters and everyone on here with the flags. If you don't go uni, your parents are going to stop chatting to you. Let's be honest, yeah. So there's all of that side of it as well. So I think that having a more accurate image of black households and ordinary black life, and not thinking that everything's all got to be dramatic, is really, really important.